Right, good morning. It's Wednesday the 20th of May and you're back for another episode of Elevenses with Kevin Williams here of Survival Skills Rider Training, the topical news, controversial views and biking tips show. In this morning's show, what have we got for you? Well, we've got some news. A German prince has died in a bike crash. If you can't beat them, MCN has launched its own weekly news video. I've got the latest news for bike trainers, which is that there is no news. Hawes closed its doors to bikers on Sunday at the weekend, and the police have waded in with some advice for bikers, which is turning into a bit of a row. We've also got the latest in the series of superbike interviews regarding Norton, which I'll give you a link to at the end of the show. And to round off, I've got some more riding tips post-biking lockdown, avoiding what I call the throttle trap. Okay, so, all right. Casualty list is continuing to grow as the biking lockdowns eased. I've mentioned a number of times that despite the lockdown, biking fatalities and the serious injuries, crashes are remaining worryingly high level. Just this morning, my newsfeed told me about at least 2 more fatal accidents and 2 serious accidents in the last 48 hours. And sadly, it's not just over here that people are crashing. I'm getting reports from all over the world. And the latest one was a fairly high-profile crash in Germany. Prince Otto of the House of Hesse was killed whilst out riding his Ducati on the Autobahn near Lake Constance, which is down in the south of Germany. On Sunday, the circumstances aren't entirely clear, although some reports are suggesting that speed would have been a factor. He's thought to have swerved after overtaking another vehicle. And he was descended from a royal dynasty with links to the Prussian royal house, but also the British royal family as well, of course. If you can't beat them, it's been almost 2 months since Elevenses kicked off, and Motorcycle News have just announced that they're starting a weekly wind-up, they're calling it, which is a roundup of the stories that matter in motorbikes. And in the current one, they've covered the changing lockdown rules for motorcyclists, tips for getting back on the bike after a break, and they've also looked at why Grant Shapps, your transport secretary, remember, why he needed a reminder to include powered 2-wheelers in post-lockdown transport. Remember, you heard it here first. A week or so back, I mentioned that the DIA, the Driving Instructors Association, of which I'm a member, had asked for guidance from the DVSA, the Driving and Vehicle Standards Agency, on what the relaxation or lockdown meant for driving instructors and bike trainers, who quite clearly we all fall into the category of people who cannot work from home. equally clearly, it's going to be difficult to social distance whilst you're sharing a car with somebody. Motorcycle trainers, on the other hand, were arguing that because they're naturally socially distanced by being on a different bike, they were taking the ease of the lockdown as a possible message that they could return to work. Now, obviously, if you're a bike trainer, whilst you do spend a lot of the time actually on the bike, you're not completely socially separated. You do have to get off the bike and talk to people. There's the sort of meet and greet bit at the beginning of a course, and there's a CBT certificate or whatever to be handed over at the end of a course. And you're also stopping at intervals to deliver sort of theory and sort of feedback on riding. So there is an element where you are sort of exposed a little bit more than you would be if you were socially distancing under normal circumstances. However, I take their point. The problem is that the continued use of the word essential is in the guidance. And so my reading of it was that certainly for my angle of training, which is post-test, I don't fall into that category. But the big problem really, and I say this perfectly honestly, as an ordinary observer of what's been said by the government, the message that was delivered was so vague as to be open to interpretation from either end. As guidance, you might say it was useless. So the DIA last week, as soon as Boris made his statement, they tackled the DVSA on this matter, and the DVSA said in response that they had held internal consultations, but they were waiting for an update from central government. So that was 8 to 9 days ago, and I was told in the email that the DIA would update us all as soon as they had a firm word. Well, so something over a week further on, where are we? Well, the answer is that the DIA don't seem to have heard back from the DVSA with a firm reply one way or the other, so we still don't know. Now, the DIA are themselves part of a broader industry body called the NASP, which I can't remember what that stands for. But they sent out a mail this morning to all DIA members, and they said, we have not received official guidance from the government as yet in respect of a date they feel it is appropriate for driver and rider training to fully resume. Remember, you can still do CBTs for essential workers. The DVSA have recently tweeted that their advice is driving instructors should limit instruction to key workers preparing for an essential driving test. Well, there's a problem there because people are trying to get hold of driving tests and they are failing. Anyway, whatever. The NASP then continued by saying, we are asking government daily for updated guidance specifically for driver and rider trainers, and as soon as we receive it, we'll share it with members. So there you are. We're still waiting for guidance on what's what. Still to come in Elevenses, we'll be talking about Norton. We will be mentioning something I call the Throttle Trap. Don't forget, if you have any questions, any feedback, any suggestions for things you'd like me to cover, drop them off in the comment stream at the bottom, and I'll get back to them as and when I can at the end of the show. Always interested to hear what people have to say. Now, okay, on to what's been going on around the world at the weekend. Now, you're probably aware that a number of the motorcycling organisations, BMF, Motorcycle Action Group, MCIA, all published some advice to bikers, which essentially said, don't gather in large groups and think twice before heading to well-known meeting points. So what happened over the weekend? Bikers gathering in large groups headed straight to the well-known meeting points. Saturday was barely over before a video of 100 plus riders was on my Facebook feed, showing a big 100 riders travelling down to Rye in Kent. And up in Yorkshire, local residents were increasingly concerned about a large number of riders who've been heading to beauty spots in that particular area. Hawes was one of those locations, and here's what the Hawes and High Abbotside Parish Council Chair, Jill McMullen, had to say. She said, there were a lot of people in Hawes who were very worried about this issue. She said, I heard them coming past my house at 8 o'clock this morning, and they've never stopped since. The majority aren't social distancing. Some are, but most aren't, and it's totally exasperating. Councillor McMullen said the police had been in patrol on Hawes on Saturday. And she said the problem is, though, that as soon as they go, all the bikers come back again. So the town council and businesses and local residents all had a consultation on this, and they decided to shut Hawes down completely on Sunday. No shops, no takeaways open at all, and they also decided to lock the town centre toilets. So basically, the councillor said if they come and park up, there'll be nothing to do other than admire their bikes, and we'd rather they didn't do that. Okay, that's the residents of one of the favourite biking hotspots. I will perfectly, freely admit that on a nice day, I've been known to take trainees up there myself. It's a really nice place to stop and admire the view and get a bacon butty or whatever. But do we actually need to go there at the moment? Well, the police have also waded into this debate. On Monday evening, I posted something on the Facebook page, which came from the Thames Valley Police Facebook page. And to quote, the police officer involved said, although some of the government guidance has changed this week, you must only travel for essential reasons such as work or exercise. Now, predictably, that got a hot reception from bikers who were keen to argue exactly the opposite. Their interpretation of the rules is different to the police. But the police in Thames Valley aren't the only ones saying this. Richmondshire police, who are responsible for the Hawes area, they said motorcyclists are not allowed to, and I'm quoting that directly from their statement, just go for a ride under the current COVID-19 lockdown rules. Now, that was Inspector Mark G speaking. He said bikers who are just going out for a ride out are actually breaking the law. He said many motorcyclists genuinely seem to think they are legally covered to just go for a ride out. Under the current regulations, this is simply not the case. We know that the majority of riders don't want to cause any harm or upset to local communities, but they need to realise that if they break the law as it stands, the police will have to take action. He then added that if you're unsure of the law, you can go and consult the government website and check if your travel visit is going to be lawful before setting off. But as we all know, that advice is at best vague. Inspector G continues, I appreciate it's a confusing time, but ignorance is no excuse in law. You need to cover yourself. But how can you know what the law is if the advice itself is totally unclear? So not surprisingly, Richmondshire Police and Inspector G came under fire from local bikers who have taken their own interpretation of the guidance and say they're not doing anything illegal. It devolved into a follow-up statement by Inspector G, who continued to stand by his comments. He said, the government regulations are published, but I can see a debate around interpretation. Yes, well, yes, indeed. His point is that simply you need to have a justifiable reason. This may well be exercise or relaxation as per government guidelines, but it's about knowing why you are out and about and therefore making people consider their actions. So basically what he's saying is just going for a ride doesn't constitute exercise or relaxation. And we're all arguing the toss about that one because it is a matter of interpretation of what that means. He continues that social distancing needs to be maintained and you cannot gather in groups of more than two unless of the same household, etc. So I'm just trying to keep people safe within the current laws. So I'm not going to add to that debate any further except to say that if you are going riding, use your imagination, avoid those big attention-grabbing groups and don't ride to the obvious locations. This country is full of beautiful places to go and visit, and why not? The weather's fine. You are technically allowed out. So go and explore. Don't be a sheep and do what everybody else does. Right, end of. You're watching Survival Skills. Kevin Williams here with the Elevenses show. Still to come, we'll be avoiding the throttle trap for our better biking tip later on. But let's move on to an article in Superbike. Now, the interviewer, a chap called John Hogan, interviewed somebody called John Russell, who's been appointed the interim CEO of Norton by the new owners, who are, you may recall, the Indian company TVS. Now, the interview is quite long, quite detailed. Excuse me while I have a sip of my tea. John Russell's background is in the automotive industry, and he's got a long history of working in that. He's worked with Land Rover and BMW and Harley Davidson too. Having said that, my impression was that the interview actually left more questions unanswered than it actually gave answers to. Now, you'll recall, first of all, that the collapse of Norton left hundreds of prospective owners out of pocket with no bike and no refund, whilst others have received machines that are allegedly built from substandard materials. There have been reports of oil leaks, and there are also word that some of the frames that have gone out have been built from a lower grade aluminium than was originally specified. Now, when pressed by the interviewer on how the new company would take on those issues, Russell stopped short of saying that they would definitely be sorted. So, several times what he said was that the deal to buy Norton excluded was taking on responsibility for these problems as they arose under the former company structure. But what he suggested was they would be looked at positively. Now, you can read that as you will. I'd suggest that as a boutique manufacturer, as Russell put it, if they're producing one bike a week, they're going to be struggling to meet the backlog of about 500 machines which haven't been delivered, let alone fix the unknown number of bad ones. Hogan suggests it's a 10-year backlog. So production basically would need to be up considerably to put a dent in those numbers. And it's going to be a fairly significant financial commitment. Now, I don't know how many of the undelivered machines have been paid for in full, but clearly that money disappeared down the drain of the previous structure. And if that's lost, that won't be coming to TVS and the new Norton. There's also a second very complex question. It's one actually I was trying to do some digging around in recently, but I kind of ran into a bit of a brick wall. There's a rather complex question about just what the new Norton incarnation actually owns in terms of the engines, the intellectual property, as it were, because the previous ownership sold off or licensed production of various engines to Chinese manufacturers, including, you may recall, Zhongshan. So that was something that wasn't asked. What, perhaps because there's no answer to this, perhaps because they wanted to skirt around the issue, what happens if you've ordered a model that was supposed to be built with a motor that Ghana has actually disposed of as an asset? If that asset hasn't transferred to the new Norton company, what can you do about that? I have no idea. Something else that jumped out of me from that interview was one particular question that John Hogan asked. He said, "Can you give confirmation that there is absolutely no involvement with Stuart Garner anymore?" And here's the answer. The Stuart Garner stuff is obviously confidential to the purchase deal, so I'm not going to talk about it. The very least I can say is that Stuart has no more operational role in the business going forward. Any association that he has with us is consultative and based on the transition out of the old arrangement. So he's not engaged with any of our people, and he's not involved with any of the management decision making. He'll be on the site because we're neighbours and everyone is seeking to be gracious. Well, personally, I'm not sure that being gracious to someone who emptied the pension pots of hundreds of people who thought they were making provision for their own futures is actually a good course, but hey-ho. I'm sure that they do need at least to know what was going on with Norton, and that there would be a transition period while they work all this out. Nevertheless, in terms of international vehicle manufacturing, 500 bikes is pretty small beer. There's clearly a lot to be done to rebuild customer confidence in Norton, but TVS do have resources. And in theory, they should be able to swallow the costs of putting things right and come out of the other side, hopefully smelling of roses. Right, okay, I'll put the link to that up in at the end of the show, and you can go and read the entire interview. So, all right, don't forget you're watching Kevin Williams and Survival Skills and the Elevenses show. And if you can't ride, if you're not one of those lucky ones who's back out on the bike, you can at least read. If you head over to my bookstore, you can buy my paperbacks and pick up something hopefully useful while you're off the bike. So I want to round off today with a tip again to help you think about what you're going to do back on the bike. Now, the interesting thing about having had a layoff is actually it's a good time to be working on our riding technique. We're actually all going to be a little bit rusty when we get out there. So now is a good time to break old and bad habits. And here's something I think you need to, or I would like you to think about. Check out what I call the throttle trap, and why it is that we need to think about making separate inputs that make the bike change speed from the inputs that make it change direction. Now, ever since I started running cornering courses, my advice has always been make sure that you separate anything that changes the speed of the bike to anything that changes the lean. In other words, get braking done in a straight line. Then the idea is to get gently back on the throttle to maintain speed through the bend. That gives the bike stability, but then you steer, and then when the bike is pointed the right way again, that's when you can twist the throttle to accelerate harder away from the corner and regain speed. Now, I repeated that advice in an article on planned cornering a couple of years ago, and I came in for some criticism because people suggested that I'm out of date. That basically what happened was the criticism was that modern tyres, to quote, offer so much grip that they easily outperform the vast majority of riders. And the upshot of the argument was that because they have reserves of grip that riders aren't using, it's perfectly safe to accelerate from mid-corner and out of the bend to get more drive. Now, I can't disagree that tyres are a lot better than they used to be. It's years since I rode on a scarily bad tyre. I can't even remember the last time that I got off a tyre and thought, I really, really, really want to get rid of that as quickly as I possibly can. And I can't disagree with the second part either. Most of us get nowhere near to the limits of a bike under normal riding. If we do, we are pushing far too hard on the road, but perfectly safe. Well, you know my thinking on the word safe when talking about motorcycles, and that they basically are mutually exclusive. And there's a glaring error in the assumptions behind that statement, but it's a trap that a lot of us tend to fall into at one time or another. I've certainly done it myself in the past. The important thing that you have to remember is that grip consists of two parts. It may be the tyre offering you grip, but the road surface has to do its part of the bargain. You can't have grip without a tyre that offers grip, and you cannot have grip without a road surface that offers grip. You can fit a tyre designed to circumnavigate the world, and you can fit a tyre that's designed to last a 20-lap race, and neither will perform any better than the other on ice. If you have no grip, no tyre will offer anything. So we have to consider the road surface. Now, when you are riding out on the road, one thing that you should notice almost immediately is that the road surface changes, and that means the level of grip it offers changes too. It can and does change in an instant. Now, here's a little story for you to tell you exactly what I mean. Just a couple of months before I actually wrote the original article, I'd been out riding around New Zealand working on the Shiny Side Up events for the NZ Transport Agency. And you may recall that in 2018, I was riding a big 1000cc V-Strom. Now, one afternoon, we were riding from one venue to another, and I was midway through a sort of fairly modest left-hand bend. It wasn't particularly sharp or anything. And that was at a fairly modest lean angle too, because the shower was a bit damp after a short shower. Now, everybody should know that after a dry spell, a quick shower tends to leave the road surface more slippery than normal. So I was taking it very steady. Nevertheless, because I had a clear view right through the corner, and I was coming towards the end of the corner, I was accelerating, not heavily, but I was starting to pick up speed. And that's when I fell into the throttle trap. I simply hit an especially slippery patch. The back end stepped out, and then I got the bike under control again without too much effort. It wasn't before I'd gone wrong side of the centre line. Now, I was lucky. There was nothing coming the other way. If there had been, that could have been rather more tricky. But that twitch was dramatic enough that the car behind me, who'd been tailgating me through the corners because I wasn't going fast enough on that damp surface, backed right off. When I did look in the mirror, instead of being about 3 foot behind the number plate, he was actually several hundred meters behind. So he'd obviously hit the brakes. It was dramatic enough to frighten the life out of him. Well, okay. So clearly that gentle acceleration that I was applying, that drive from the throttle, was enough to let the back end go on that particular patch of road. And that's the throttle trap. Your tyre is only ever as good as the road surface. Now, you may have heard of something called traction pie. The idea of the traction pie is to give a visual representation of tyre grip. Now, basically, you imagine a pie. Imagine you stick a sort of pin or something in the middle of it, your fork, if you like. As long as you only cut as far as the body of the pie and you stay away from the crust, you are operating within the grip of the tyre. But once you actually get out there and start cutting through the crust itself, you've reached the edge of grip, and there is nothing left once you've sliced through that crust. Now, the usual interpretation of this, and it's something I'll have a look at a bit more next week, is it's possible to mix and match accelerating and braking and cornering forces by slicing in a slightly different direction. In other words, you can use all the grip for braking, you can use all the grip for accelerating, or by slicing the pie at an angle, you can do a bit of both. You can have some acceleration and some cornering, or you can have some braking and some cornering. So, okay. But as long as we don't do too much of either, we won't actually reach the crust and we'll be okay. But it leaves out one huge what-if question that you should always keep in mind. Your pie that you've just bought from your local baker won't change size, but the traction pie on the road can and does, and it will do so regularly as you move over the road surface, because the road surface simply is not consistent in terms of grip. So the chunk of pie that you sliced through that you thought was well within the crust, suddenly you've gone from a family-sized pie to a one-bite pie, and you've simply run out of grip. And that's exactly what happened to me that day on the V-Strom. Now, what happens if the available grip level changes? Well, we're kind of aware of this because no one argues with the benefit of keeping the bike upright under braking. When we do, we can use 100% of the tyre's grip and whatever the back can do as well for braking. That's because upright, 100% of that pie is used for braking and nothing is being used for steering. And here's the really key point. If we exceed the level of available grip, as long as we're upright, the bike slides in a straight line, long enough for us to regain control under most circumstances. But the moment we're trying to brake into a corner, now we're mixing and matching the vector forces operating on the bike, and some of that vector force is being used to stop the bike sliding out in the corner. If we reach the edge of grip and we lose traction, then the front tyre is not going to slide in a straight line. It's going to slide at a tangent to the path we were trying to take. Essentially, it'll slide out from under the bike. So the result of that, and I can tell you from personal experience, is nearly always a crash. I have saved a front tyre slide, but it was luck more than judgment, and it involved a size 9 boot, hefty application thereof. Generally speaking, once the front goes, it's a bit like shark attack. There's no way back from it. Okay, but you don't have to worry because you've got ABS, I hear you say. Well, what's the first thing that most people do when the ABS kicks in? It's they let go of the brakes. Now, you may be able to get them on again, and you may be able to brake without triggering the ABS, but you now have a reduced amount of space to slow down. Are you going to make it? ABS doesn't work miracles. If you haven't got sufficient space to slow down, then you're in trouble. And there are different opinions on how well ABS will work if it triggers mid-corner. Based on my own very, very limited experience, a bike will still stay upright on the ABS unless you're really. I haven't ever tried it at vastly huge lean angles, but a modest lean angle with the ABS triggers, the bike stays upright, but the front tire starts to drift out from under. So you have to react and release and reapply. With cornering ABS, well, I honestly say I've never actually had a bike with cornering ABS, so I have no experience whatsoever of that. But even so, I wouldn't be relying on that to get me around the corner if something goes wrong. ABS is there to get you out of trouble, not to help you into it. So what's all this? Right, hopefully I am back. Sorry about that. We, as you can see, still having problems with the broadband dropping every time the phone rings. I think what I'll do next time I'm on air is actually pull the phone out the wall, and that'll hopefully solve that problem. Anyway, hopefully you can all see me again. So where was I? I was talking about the problems of using the throttle pie in corners. Now, I mentioned that we try to do our braking upright in a straight line if we possibly can, because if we do get a slide on, the bike simply slides in a straight line and it's easy to deal with. The same applies at the rear. If we are accelerating and we lose grip at the rear tire, if we're upright, all that happens is the rear tire spins rather than locks. Obviously it spins, and if we're upright, it's no big deal. The bike still goes in a straight line. We just back off the throttle and the tire regains grip. I've actually wheel spun on black ice when I was doing a blood run at 3 o'clock one January morning, but fortunately I was upright when I applied the throttle, so I was able to ride out the other side even though I had absolutely zero grip from the rear. The tire spun up so fast that I actually thought I'd missed a gear, so I changed the gear and did it again. So yeah, upright wheel spin is easy to deal with, but as soon as we add lean angle, then we have that problem of vectors. As soon as we've got lean angle on the bike, then as soon as the rear wheel spins, the rear end of the bike will start to slide out sideways. Now, with a bit of luck and a mild lean angle, we may be able to recover by steering into the slide and shutting the throttle. That's in fact how I got out of trouble in New Zealand. It was mostly me shutting the throttle. As soon as I did that, the bike actually snapped itself pretty much upright. But personal experience, again, suggests that usually that loss of traction is sudden enough that the back end's gone too far round before we can actually attempt that recovery. I have also shut the throttle in the middle of a rear end slide and taken that short, sharp flight that people call a high side. So the recovery from rear end slide is not nearly so easy as if we've got the bike at an angle. So if I'd have had any serious amount of gas on that V-Strom, 100 horsepower would almost certainly have caused a big crash very, very quickly indeed. Now, here's a really interesting bit. The V-Strom actually has traction control. And one of the things I'd made a point of doing was looking to see what button operated what and how it worked and all the rest of it. And I'd noticed as I took delivery of the bike that the previous rider had actually turned the traction control off. Apparently they'd been riding it off-road. So I turned it back on, so I know the traction control was on, and it didn't catch the slide. Now, why is that? A good question. I don't know. Perhaps the traction control is only a fairly basic version of traction control. But my speculation is that it was because the tyre was mostly sliding sideways rather than spinning because of my fairly modest throttle opening. So there was no warning to the traction control system that I was in fact gassing it hard with no spin up, so I just didn't do anything. And the result was, of course, once the tire's sliding, traction control can't really do anything to stop it. The tire's still going to slide. It will stop it spinning, but it can't stop it sliding. So anyway, whatever, it didn't work as billed on the one moment on that 5,000 kilometer ride. It would have been useful. So whatever aids you have on a bike, my advice for the road remains: separate the throttle and the steering inputs, steady throttle when leaning, and accelerate only hard when upright. Basically, The advice to power out of corners from the midpoint of the corner is racetrack advice, because what it relies on is the consistent grip that you get on a racetrack. I would certainly use the technique at Brands Hatch to power out of corners, no problem whatsoever when I'm doing a track day. But as soon as I